hopes to look at climate change like a bear. The whole planet's been wrestling with the bear for decades. So far, the bear's been kicking our ass.
What if we were able to develop technology that would allow us to survive? Maybe even...
Mr. Vice President, if we don't act now, it's going to be too late.
I'm afraid that time has come and gone, my friend.
What can we do?
There's a 100% chance that we're all going to die.
Kate?
Hey.
Well, the handsome astronomer can come back anytime, but the yelling lady, not so
much.
It's a genre that has been growing in popularity as the climate crisis deepens. Cli-fi, or climate fiction. Films such as The Day After Tomorrow or Don't Look Up or the new streaming series Extrapolations are attracting large audiences. And no matter which streaming service you go for, they'll be sure to have some cli-fi series or movies in their database for you. And then there is, of course, a growing list of cli-fi literature to choose from. My name is Neil King, and in this episode of On the Green Fence, I'll be taking a closer look at the rise of climate fiction and the role it can play in humanity's struggle against the climate crisis. Now, even though the term cli-fi was allegedly coined by the environmental activist Dan Bloom around 2008, the genre of climate fiction has been around a lot longer. Some say since the mid-20th century. Some works from the 19th century can also qualify as cli-fi. So how do you define cli-fi? Well, to keep it as short as possible, basically cli-fi makes use of utopian or dystopian settings to explore the potential consequences of climate change to both our planet and humanity. And like its cousin, science fiction, it to varying degrees draws on both facts or scientific data and weaves them together with fictional elements. And to discuss the relevance of this genre, I got in touch with Gregers Andersen, who's an assistant professor in environmental humanities at Aalborg University in Denmark. He's been studying topics related to the climate crisis and culture for well over a decade, and he also published one of the first monographs on climate fiction, in which he analysed over 60 works of German and English language fiction, including novels by Frank Schätzing and Kim Stanley Robinson. And perhaps a bit of a spoiler here, Gregers firmly believes that cli-fi does have an important role to play. What would you say sets cli-fi apart from other forms of literature, let's say?
Well, maybe to answer that question, we would need to look at the history of cli-fi, I guess. Because in my definition, cli-fi is exactly fictions that, so to speak, deals with the problem of anthropogenic climate change or global warming, meaning human-made climate change. The description of global warming was already present in various kinds of natural scientific explorations, hundreds of years ago. But the sort of paradigm that we know today, where there is a sort of broad international recognition that this is a major problem facing humanity, that first began to appear in the late 1970s. And it's also at that point, in the early 1970s, we see the first fictions portraying man-made global warming. So that is, to me, where cli-fi begins. And it also means that what is basically particularly interesting about cli-fi, in my eyes, is that it deals with this specific phenomenon that is today probably the main challenge facing humanity. And then the next question is, of course, well, what can we learn from fiction that deal with this major problem? And there I think it's I guess, two directions, that there is the sort of very critical potential that climate change possesses in order to sort of open our eyes to the very negative impact we as humans and as societies, as individuals, have on the globe's ecosystems. And on the other hand, there is also this sort of more utopian potential in cli-fi that sort of enable us to see perhaps ways that we can move beyond this crisis, sort of imaginaries of new ways of living, new ways of creating, having societies. So there is both this sort of very critical potential that sort of move often into the future in order to show us what will happen if we continue on this destructive path that we're on. And at the same time, there is also more a lot of fiction trying to inspire us to move into other ways, for example, of treating the non-human world, or basically showing us different paths that can take us beyond this crisis that we're facing.
I mean, you just said it as well, that, it's like two camps in the cli-fi genre, right? One is more dystopian, the other one is perhaps more utopian, perhaps also more constructive. I mean, how would you say is cli-fi, or has it been developing, against the backdrop of the climate crisis, given that we know so much more about the climate crisis today? Is it becoming more dystopian, or is it becoming more constructive?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I think there's always been a close connection between cli-fi and what could be called disaster fiction. Many of the early cli-fis are basically sort of falls within the genre of disaster fiction as well. So they deal with sort of very monstrous weather events that cause major problems for humans, basically. So there's always been quite a sort of a negative and very alarmist trend or stream within cli-fi. And I think basically that has continued to dominate ever since the beginning of the birth of the genre, basically. And it's still, I think, dominant today. So what I'm seeing today at least, is a lot of different fictions, from TV series or movies to literary works, that basically, again, are placed in futures where the climate crisis has already run amok, or, where we have definitely moved beyond the tipping points that the climate scientists are telling us is there within the climate system, and we are moving closer and closer and extremely dangerously towards transgressing at the moment, and will probably transgress them within the next 5 years if we have not already transgressed them. And a lot of the climate fictions that are made today are definitely placed in futures where that has already happened, and where, so they are quite dystopian. They are filled with worlds that are basically flooded, heated, where there is a scarcity of food and water, where ecosystems have disappeared. A lot of different species has gone extinct. So that is a very sort of dominant trend, I would say, still in cli-fi to this day.
Before we talk about the impact that this might be having, both the positive and the negative, perhaps, can you perhaps tell us a bit more? What do we know about the readers of climate fiction, the consumers? Who are they?
Oh, that's a difficult question. That's not really something that I have gone into in my research. There are some sort of few scholarly articles on this, and what they are telling us is basically that the readers tend to be already concerned with the issue. So the readers are typically concerned with anthropogenic climate change already. And what the reading of the cli-fi does to them is basically that they become more concerned. Whereas readers who are not really concerned about the issue when they start reading, they quickly tend to, ignore the threats and the challenges that the cli-fi bring to life.
That's what I was going to also would have been my next question, because I understand also that the critics of cli-fi, they say that it, simply reinforces existing views rather than changing or shifting them, and that, the skeptics or the unconvinced, they will see these stories as proof that this issue is a fiction, exaggerated for dramatic effect, and that there's no evidence that climate fiction will actually inspire climate action in this regard. That would be my question. Is this something that is a useless exercise because it's preaching to the choir, so to speak?
I think to answer that question, we also need to go back and basically look at what does the science, the natural sciences look like? What does the world that appears in different kind of climate reports and scholarly climate scientific articles look like? What does the world that appears in in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what does the worlds that appear in their report look like? And what does they basically tell us about what future life will be like? And I think what they do that to a certain extent, but it's lacking, you know. It's not something that we can basically, that sort of spark our imagination. So I think fiction has a very important role, actually, because it basically puts people who experience the world into these kinds of world that are only sketched superficially in the natural scientific projections of, you know, future worlds. So basically what cli-fi opens us up to is basically the different kinds of experiences that, you know, climate change could basically foster in the future. And I think that is very important, that we get, you know, speculation is actually very important, because speculation can either inspire us, but it can also enable us to perceive possible dangers that may appear if we, for example, transgress the tipping points in the climate system. So I think cli-fi is sort of, I see it as basically as a supplement to the climate scientific projections of future worlds.
But is there, I mean, in your research, is there any evidence that would show or prove that this genre is actually helping address the climate crisis, that it's changing consumers to a degree that they do become active? Because, I mean, I also understand that some critics, they fear that cli-fi could actually be harmful because it, and I'm quoting here, because it stunts the cultural ability to imagine a future worth living in or fighting for. So that it sort of puts them in a paralysis almost, sort of, yeah, what's the point if it's going to be at that bleak? Why should I even bother? How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't believe that is correct. You know, I guess you could argue that, and I would agree that to a certain extent it may be the case of some cli-fis. Let's say, for example, let's take The Day After Tomorrow.
The storm is just going to get worse.
What should we do?
I will come for you. Do you understand me?
Roland Emmerich's sort of blockbuster disaster movie from 2004. Well, that is basically, I don't think that, you know, the audience of that film, which is reappearing all the time, at least on Danish television, I don't think the viewers of that movie does really, you know, there's anything in that movie that could sort of spark their activism. It's basically entertainment, like all disaster fiction. There is this major crisis at the beginning, and then there is some kind of solution at the end that sort of bring the viewers relief. But I think there are definitely a lot of other fictions that are more reflective, that are, you know, have a bigger potential again for inspiring us towards new ways of being, and also basically making it clear for us the potential dangers that we are facing when we play, as we do at the moment as a species, with our ecosystems and the climate systems.
Can you perhaps give me a good example there? What would be, you know, if somebody's listening to this and thinks, I want to go or read or see something that is exactly this, what would it be?
I think there are many examples, actually. For example, you know, Don't Look Up is perhaps, you know, it's not an obvious cli-fi, but it's the cli-fi that, you know, it's probably also sparked debate in Germany, because it has this sort of very sharp, critical edge to it.
I hear there's something you don't like the looks of.
We discovered a very large comet.
Oh, good for you. It's headed directly towards Earth.
This comet is what we call a planet killer.
At this exact moment, I say we sit tight and assess.
Sit tight and assess?
Sit tight.
And then assess.
But I actually think, you know, it demonstrates quite clearly sort of from a critical point of view, all the sort of the noise and the, you know, the political nonsense, the nonsense of social media and the sort of the traditional media that is basically also blocking for a serious deliberation about how we should tackle as societies, as individuals, as a species, the climate crisis. So I think that's a sort of very actual and recent example of a fiction that is sort of has something important to say. And then there's, of course, a lot of cli-fi that sort of addresses various more specific issues that could, again, that sort of the climate crisis make prominent. For example, there is the book by John Lanchester called The Wall that deals with how the British society will potentially tackle climate refugees, large streams of climate refugees in the future.
A concrete poem. It feels an appropriate form for Life on the Wall, because for a start, Life on the Wall is more like a poem than it is like a story. Days don't vary much. There isn't much A to B. There isn't much narrative. You do have the constant prospect of action, the constant risk of sudden and total disaster. But that's not the same as stuff actually happening. Most days, it doesn't. The thing a typical day most resembles is the day before and the day after. It's less like a form of time and more like a physical element. Time is a thing.
Which is, again, something I think that is something that we will probably experience. So again, I think that is very a fiction that is really helping us see the difficult dangers that could occur to our own humanity if we are not careful when, for example, we are facing large streams of climate refugees.
I mean, there is one thing that I also feel, if I'm sort of thinking, with climate change, I think part of the problem also that a lot of scientists get frustrated about is the fact that there's this temporal distance. I mean, in cosmic terms, it's happening super fast, but in human terms, it's taking a long time for catastrophe to actually really set in. And hence, it's sometimes quite difficult to get people to act on this threat, right? This temporal distance. And I guess climate fiction, it has the ability to put us in a situation in the future. It can basically fast forward and drop us in it and give us the facts mixed with the knock-on effects. A lot of it is conjecture, but a lot of it is based on fact, right? So, and that's something that science. If you did that with science, right, you wouldn't be accepted within the scientific community.
Exactly. Right? That's the speculation, right? That's, there are some norms that prevents scientists from moving into, to going into that kind of speculation. And that's my point when I state that, that I see fiction or cli-fi as a sort of supplement to the scientific, the natural scientific projection. It is exactly that it possesses this ability or that it allows itself to speculate, and it can speculate in a totally different way than the natural sciences are allowed to do.
But then, I mean, I'm also sort of wondering, we talked about it briefly about how effective dystopian approach can actually be to galvanize people into taking action on climate change. Or whether it might in fact be more paralytic in a sense. I mean, you've been looking into this or studying this for well over a decade, I understand, right? Is the genre evolving? Is it changing into something where this is taken more into account, and perhaps the writers are portraying more the possibilities of a future? If we get this right, we could actually create a fantastic future for us, because it's forcing us to really question fundamental things also within society. So we do have the opportunity here to create a brand new society based on sustainability and more equality and justice for all, right? Is that being reflected in this genre at all, or is it more doom-mongering?
No, because I think to a certain extent, reality is moving in a different direction. So every year, we put more, as a species, the global carbon emissions increases every year. And at the same time, every time there is a new scientific report by the UN, it's basically more alarming than the previous one. It's not very likely, unfortunately, that we'll be able to avoid, the transgressions of sort of tipping elements, and then we are basically in a sort of unknown territory. Of course, we can look to how the climate has evolved at previous stages in Earth's history, but that was before the humans entered the scene. So we are basically in unknown territory. We know it will become bad, but we don't know exactly how. And I think that many authors and filmmakers are well aware that this is actually where we are at, scientifically speaking. So it's no coincidence that they perhaps tend to depict those kinds of world more than more utopian ones. But again, so if you look to theory, for example, because it's not just that, I know now this is a digression in terms of cli-fi, but there's also, of course, in theory, for example, there is degrowth theory, where there is also a lot of different ideas of how the future could basically be turned into more benevolent futures. So there are various kinds of theorists trying to basically, in a sort of more detailed and meticulous way, try to sort of describe, what could be the political instruments, what could be the behavioral changes, and that would basically put us onto a better path. And some of that also goes into cli-fi. For example, Kim Stanley Robinson is sort of a very, perhaps even famous or at least well-known author within cli-fi, and he tends to be rather, his novels tends to be rather optimistic and utopian in this regard, that they are very focused on pointing towards solutions that can move us beyond the sort of our present course towards global disaster.
Methods to keep water out kept improving. Vlade was currently working with the team from the local waterproofing association that had casoned the Madison Square side of the building to reseal the building's wall and the old sidewalk. The aquaculture cages covering the floor of the Bacino had to be avoided, making for a tight squeeze, but the latest Dutch equipment could be angled and accordioned in a way that gave them room to work. Then, new pumps, dryers, sterilizers, sealants, all better than ever, even though the same work.
The solutions aspect is something that I find very interesting in this regard, because it's also something that is becoming stronger in the media, right, in covering climate change and the climate crisis, that people are becoming a bit sick and tired of all the doom and gloom, and they don't want to hear all the bad news. They want solutions. They want ideas, how we can get out of this mess and how we can make things better. But if I understood you correctly, that isn't something that is, or carries a lot of weight in the cli-fi genre at the moment, but could be growing?
Yeah, but it's also, there's also, other genres where it's sort of that, again, it depends on also how you defined cli-fi, because there is also, of course, eco-poetry or eco-literature, and I think there is a big tendency at the moment, and it's also a tendency in contemporary philosophy, to basically to look at different ways to sort of reorient our perception of the humans, and to basically make us understand how entangled we are with the non-human, from bacteria to the climate. So I think that there is a big tendency towards to that basically within the arts at the moment, that try to basically to enhance our sensibility towards the non-human world in order to make us behave or act more sustainable. And this is also a little tendency in cli-fi. But on the other hand, there is this also, I guess, major critique at play, because I think it's difficult to find reasons for optimism, because the optimism is already present in the political discourse, in economic discourses of green growth and technological solutions, techno-optimism. There is a lot of that beyond the arts and beyond cli-fi and literature, and it's basically dominating the directions for our societies. So I think that it's it would be to a certain extent also problematic if cli-fi would be only emulating or copying or reproducing that kind of optimism, because history at the moment tells us that it's not really it's unfounded, that optimism. For the last 30 years we've been talking about green growth and in solving the climate crisis, and still the global emissions of carbon dioxide increases every year. So I think that the authors are right in being, or the filmmakers are right in being skeptical towards that kind of optimism.
But then, Gregers, I mean, it's perhaps a bit of a provocative question then. I mean, why do we need cli-fi then? What role is it fulfilling if there's the grounds for optimism, isn't really there? And what role does it fulfill other than, put people in a really bad place?
So on the one hand, I would say, well, there is still a need, because we're standing at this threshold where on the one hand, we can still, remain on a stable earth or in a stable climate. And as long as there is that possibility, cli-fi has a role to play in terms of inspiring transformation on the one hand. On the other hand, it is unfortunately extremely likely that we will move into this sort of more catastrophous or disastrous territory where it's sort of unclear what will happen. And I think also in that regard, cli-fi has a major role to play, because again, it allows itself to speculate. What would these sort of extremely chaotic, disastrous future climate devastated worlds look like? And what would it mean to be humans in them? Can they, so to speak, also unveil or reveal the risks that we might, face, or future humans might face in 2 or 3 decades, and what can we learn from that? How can it sort of can point to various dangers that hopefully can help us, that the cli-fi can help us avoid. So I think there is also sort of a preemptive potential within that kind of speculation that cli-fi allows itself to do, that although the situation, the geopolitical situation is very bleak, I still think there is this role for cli-fi to play that is nonetheless important, as it can both inspire and reveal again risks that are possible, that humanity will possibly face in the future.
Gregers, thank you very much for your time and expertise. I really appreciate you joining me here with On the Green Fence.
No problem, Neil. It was a pleasure.
So, having talked to Gregers, I was keen to find out more about the psychological impact that cli-fi has on consumers. Is it really a good idea to put readers or viewers into dystopian, nightmarish settings if you want to galvanize them into taking the climate crisis seriously and ideally also taking action? Or is cli-fi actually bad for us and counterproductive in this regard? And precisely this psychological level is what I'll be discussing with the environmental psychologist Catharina Stentjes from Cardiff University in Wales in our next episode of On the Green Fence. So I do hope you'll join me for that. If you have any questions or would like to share your thoughts on cli-fi, please just drop us a line or a voicemail to onthegreenfence@dw.com. Maybe you also have some novels or films you'd like to recommend. Many thanks to my colleague and co-producer Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Jürgen Kuhn. And a big thank you to all of you for listening, sharing, reviewing and subscribing to On the Green Fence. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.